Welcome back to the Fantasy Football Veteran Series by Fantasy Football Hub. So in the previous videos in this series, we met Will Thomas, learned about his incredible fantasy football record and history and how he managed to make a business out of it. If you missed it, the links are in the description below. In this video, we are going to ask Will for his fantasy football tips. So firstly, Will, what is the best piece of fantasy football advice you've ever received?
That's a really tough one. I had a little bit of think about this. I'm actually going to give some credit to Luke Williams, who is a big Sky fantasy football pundit, and his articles back in the day really got me into playing Sky Fantasy, and he really sort of explained how the captaincy system works and how you could link captains over weekends together. I won't go into it now because it is quite complex, but and indeed it's changed now. They've scrapped that old captaincy system, but that captaincy system was very useful, and it really did give sort of the more committed and experienced manager a big edge. And yeah, as I mentioned in a previous video, that's how I came top of the Sky Fantasy Football cash leagues and won around 8k. So I think got to give Luke some credit for that captaincy tip, but also some of the early ones that he did, because he really was one of the only guys blogging about Sky Fantasy back in the day. So that paid for a trip to Cuba, and needless to say, my partner Charlotte didn't mind me spending so much time on fantasy football after that. So I'm probably most grateful for that tip.
I owe him a pint or two by the sound of it as well, Will, after that.
Definitely do.
What is the biggest mistake that you see fantasy football managers make?
This is another tough one, actually. And I think for the season just gone, it's actually been a fairly successful strategy. But I'm going to talk about, having played fantasy football for over 10 years. And I think the biggest mistake that I see, generally the casual manager make is just picking last week's top point scorer, and whoever did well on match of the day, whoever got a brace last week, just bringing them in. And I think it's the obvious thing to do, isn't it? And you see someone doing well, you bring them into your team, everyone else brings them into the team, you get a little bit a short-term boost in your money. It makes a lot of sense for a lot of different reasons. But I would say that, are they the best player that you could bring in? Do they have the best upcoming fixtures? Have their form been good previously? Or was it a defensive midfielder who just happened to score the first brace of his entire career? Are there better value players out there? So are you getting the best pick in terms of the best value for money? And of course, do they have good underlying numbers? So these are all the things which I would look beyond, just last week's biggest point scorer. But again, it can occasionally be a successful tactic. So I wouldn't always knock it. And certainly last week's top point scorer might also be a good fantasy pick. So it's certainly not something which I'd knock completely. But generally, if you look at the more experienced managers, then they tend to look a little bit deeper than just last week's points.
Sure. And I think a lot of that stuff you just mentioned then, Will, is in the how to play FPL and how to win it FPL articles you've got on the site as well. A lot of the kind of mindset in terms of when you're looking at a transfer, what are the things to actually think about or consider. A lot of that stuff, I think we've got that on the website for FPL, Sky and Telegraph as well, haven't we? So they're well worth it.
Yeah, we've got an article which I've co-written with FPL Eisenberg, is another very, very good player, and there's also a whole video series which I pulled together if you prefer video format, and if you're watching this and maybe you do, on how to win and how to do well at FPL.
Cool. What is your biggest tip for fantasy football managers? What's the one thing which you do well that you'd be able to share with people?
Yeah, I'm going to say this with it's how I've learned to do well at fantasy football. I wouldn't say it's 100% how everybody does well at fantasy football, because I know that there are some good players who don't do this. But from my personal experience, and the thing that I guess sort of takes you to the next level, certainly from when I've been playing fantasy football, is to look at the stats. And well, I certainly don't have time, but if you do, then fantastic. But I don't have time to watch all 10 Premier League games at the weekend. So, looking at the numbers really does give you a big overall look at how players have been performing. It also sort of takes a little bit of the emotion out of it. If you see a player score a 30-yard screamer, then you might think that, they must be playing well. They're a great player to bring in. But, personally, I would much rather see a player miss 20, 10-meter shots than I would think that that's a better player in terms from a fancy perspective compared to the one who just scored a long-term screener, because over the long haul, the player who gets a lot of shots from close by is likely to get more goals and likely to get more fancy points. And looking at the numbers and looking at the underlying shot volume and things like that, and looking at the big chances that they get or the chances created, then that gives you a really good indication of what their future points are going to look like. And I think the main takeaway from this is that it's not sort of past points we care about in FPL or across fantasy sports. Really, it's future point potential, and I think looking at the numbers really gives you a good indication of that. But again, I know there are some good managers out there who don't look at the numbers that much and they just use the eye test. And I think obviously you can combine them, but for me, if you just look at the numbers, it gives you it takes that emotion out, and it just gives you sort of a logical, rational decision, and that's how my brain works, and that's how I've been fairly successful playing FPL and Sky Sports Fantasy Football.
Yeah, it's definitely. I've been an eye test manager for years and years, but since I've joined the hub, when I've seen all the tools on the hub, which includes a lot of the data, when you've got like a 50-50 in terms of maybe a transfer or or a captain. So say, I don't know, like Aguero's at home against Norwich, or you've got Kane at home against Southampton or someone like that. I really find that those stats really help you make that decision rather than flip a coin. I know FPL fantasy guide Andy Green, who came third in the 18-19 season, he used the stats religiously, and there was one kind of anecdote where he said when Salah scored a hat-trick away at Bournemouth, and his underlying stats pointed completely towards that, whereas a lot of managers, including myself, went for Kane at home to Cardiff, because if you just looked at it with your eyes, it looked like a prettier fixture, I suppose. But Andy said that was one of the key decisions in the season, which catapulted him, from the top few thousand to the top few hundred, and he ended up finishing third in the world. So that's probably a very good real life example where stats work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point as well, is you don't want to just look at the stats for the player, but also who they're playing, and do they have good or bad defenses. So yeah, there's a lot of layers to stats, but definitely you can learn a lot from it, and I think it's the way that I like to play, but it's not for everyone. And yeah, I think that, as you say, lots of good players have. I remember the guy who won FPL. I think it was 3 or 4 years ago. He lived in China, I think, and he didn't watch a single bit of football for the whole season, and he managed to win it. So I think you can definitely do very, very well at FPL by just looking at the numbers.
So quite a topical question to follow off that then. What is your favourite fantasy football tool, Will?
Yeah, very, very topical. I should say I love the comparison tool. I think it's a really, really good way of, as you say, just comparing two or more players. So you can even compare sets of players. You can compare, I don't know, Aguero and Jimenez to Salah and Jota if you wanted to compare two sets of players. Comparison tool is fantastic on site. I would say that probably my favorite tool has to be the Opta tool, though. I just think that any stat you want, you can find it within literally just a couple of clicks, and really, really easy, really accessible, and very user friendly, which I think was something which was lacking in, it was a massive gap in sort of the fantasy football landscape, was to have such a user friendly tool of trying to find stats just like at a click of a finger. So that's the tool which is my go-to every week. Well, I use that, and of course I use a lot of the other tools on site every week. But by far and away, I think just the Opta tool for its ease of use is something which I'm super proud to have on the hub, to be honest, and super grateful to our developer Steve, because he's done a fantastic job with that.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks, Will, for all your tips there. So just a very quick fire round then. Don't think, just answer, if that's okay. 4 more fixtures.
Fixtures.
Is building team value important?
Absolutely.
Is there such a thing as an essential player?
No.
Okay. Stats or eye test? I think we've already answered this one. But,
eye test. No, stats.
Yeah. Playing fancy football or running a fancy football business?
It's a tough one. I'd probably go with running a fancy football business nowadays.
And Sky or FPL?
Ooh. That's really tough. If you asked me this a couple of years ago, I would have said Sky, but it's probably FPL now.
Cool. Okay. So thank you so much, Will, for sharing your story with us. Incredible, incredibly interesting, really good insight, into the day-to-day of running a business, working in fancy football. Really interesting stuff. And thanks for all your hints and tips for all the watchers and listeners as well. Could you just remind us where we can find you and where we can get hold of you?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I'll just say that I think this whole series is going to be really, really interesting. So if you're not already subscribed to the series, then make sure that you are, because Andrew's going to be interviewing some really, really interesting people across fantasy football formats. And, if you're interested in more of the business side, if you're interested in just fancy tips, either way, I'd recommend subscribing to the channel, because, well, I'm super excited about, the caliber and the type of person that he's interviewing. I think it's going to be really interesting to view and listen to as well. In terms of my social media, you can find me at FFH_Will on Twitter, I think is the main one. But otherwise, just on site or on our Slack channel or on YouTube as well are the main points of contact.
Excellent. Thank you, Will. Okay, so if you like what you hear or what you're watching, please rate, like, share, subscribe, and retweet. It all helps us get the word out, and make sure you don't miss anything. All the links to Will's videos are in the description below. Our website is fantasyfootballhub.co.uk, where you will find everything you need for fantasy football all under one roof, including player comparison tools, the fixture ticker, Opta stats, as well as mentioned, top player team reveals, and much, much more. It really is the place to be for fantasy football. If you fancy a free 7-day Hub membership trial, just go onto the website and sign up. The link below is in the description. And we'll be back soon chatting with another fantasy football veteran. Until then, thank you and goodbye.